Welcome to Asiaedit Et al, the podcast that brings you research publishing tips direct from industry experts. I'm your host, Trevor Lane. Hello, I'm joined in this podcast by Brian Minihan, Engagement Lead of Orcid, which is a non-profit group that stands for Open Researcher and Contributor Identity. Now, you may have noticed in some online journal articles that authors' names show a small lime green circle labeled ID, and when you click it, it leads to an ORCID ID or ORCID identifier that links to a mini CV for the author. Some journals require corresponding authors to include their ORCID identifier in the manuscript submission, and some journals require all authors or peer reviewers to declare their ORCID ID. So let's find out more. Hello, Brian. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Trevor. Thanks for inviting me. Great to be here.
Good to have you. Yes. Now, to start off with, I'll ask a lot of WH questions, and then you can choose which ones to answer. So who founded Orcid, and when, and how, and why?
Sure. So Orcid was founded officially in 2012 by several large publishing groups. They actually put up a bit of money as a loan for a nonprofit organization, which came to be Orcid, to solve the author ambiguity problem. As you may know, you look at journal articles and people have common names. It's hard to figure out who is who. So there was a business proposition, and several large publishers thought that was a great idea, and that is how it started. In addition to the author ambiguity issue, they really liked the idea of building what we call a registry, and that is essentially what Orcid is. It's an index of now about 12 million researchers, their unique IDs, and everything they do.
Okay, now we'll go on to that in a second, but can you give me an example of what you mean by ambiguity, just for people who don't know?
Sure. So in publishing, especially in the old days, a lot of journals would just abbreviate your first name and then have a surname. So if you're J. Smith or L. Han, it's hard to distinguish who exactly is writing this article. Who should I give credit to this? Who should I search out for this? So by giving a 16-digit number associated with the name, if you're the Li Han that does biochemistry, that distinguishes you from all the other Li Hans that do biochemistry, and vice versa with, say, James Smith, who does Elizabethan literature. That distinguishes you from Joao Smith, like that.
Oh, yeah. So different journals have different ways of displaying the author names. Do many still just use the initial, or do many use full names now?
I still seem to see, first initials. But in any case, regardless, even if they use full names, certain cultures have very similar first names and surnames. So like in Greater China, where we are, there's not much variation between names. Also, this is a big problem in Latin America and in the Middle East as well. And in any culture, you can come up with many, many, many common names. So the point is, if you create a unique 16-digit number to match the name, that would distinguish you from other people with your same name.
Now, I can think of another example. So apart from exactly the same names, I know you're based in Hong Kong now, and I live in Hong Kong too. So Hong Kong, China, Korea, Japan, usually locally, people put their surname, their family name first. So again, there could be confusion there if they put the wrong one in the journal, or the journal typesetter chose the wrong one. I know now you can put it in the journal submission form, so you control it yourself. But if it's not that way, then someone else has coded it wrong, so you end up having your first and last names the wrong way around. So how can Orcid help there?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. In your Orcid record, you can list alternative names that you're known by. So hopefully the publisher put the surname and the name in the right order. But if you're doubtful, you can always, in your Orcid record, list the variations of your name. So, for example, if you have a non-Roman name, you can put in the, let's say, Arabic, Cyrillic, Chinese, Korean rendering of that name, because a lot of researchers don't publish in just one language or syllabary. And then, in case you've noticed that some publisher has messed up your surname by your first name, you can put that there, and then that will be publicly viewable at least.
Oh, okay, so it also works for non-English, non-Roman script. That's very useful. So the ORCID ID is like an ID code for a researcher. So that's the thing that stays constant, whatever the name, order, or language is. And it stays with them throughout their career for consistency. Now, is ORCID itself a little bit like LinkedIn or ResearchGate? Can the user control their profile, what is visible? And is ORCID like a researcher network or only just a display of someone's bio?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I will say ORCID is referred to by many people as a profile system. And it's not really, and I'll explain why. The thing is, you can control all of your settings in ORCID. So let's say if you open a ORCID record, you can set everything to privately, which means only you can see. That could be your aliases, your email, your work, your publications, everything, really. You can also set them to be visible to, let's say, trusted parties. So that would be maybe your work or folks that you publish with. And then you can set them to be fully public. So with all of the information on the ORCID record, the user always has control on that. So where does ORCID differ from profile systems? We connect with profile systems. There's a few examples like Impact Story. Lens Profiles is another one that comes to mind. But our primary function is not to connect, say like, oh, you're in New Zealand marine biology, here's somebody else that's interested in that. That's not our primary focus. Our primary focus is to form a research infrastructure where other systems, so publishers, funding management systems, current research information systems, and a lot of others can just connect to our infrastructure. So we're kind of a hub for information systems. And then if you are a profile system, you can certainly link to us. Like I said, we link to a few profile systems. We've approached many folks, so it's not for lack of trying that we haven't connected with them to date.
It's getting clearer to me now. So it's not like a social network site like ResearchGate, but it's more like a mini CV verification site.
Yeah, I think, the whole connecting people, originally at least, we thought it was probably best to leave to other people. We just want to build a infrastructure with connecting all the various parts that would benefit the researcher and save the researcher time, ultimately, because we all know that we get sick of duplicating our work, doing the same information over and over. And so that's also, maybe I should have said in the beginning, that was also one of the main goals with the founding of ORCID, is to reduce the time a researcher has to spend in interacting with funders, publishers, their own institutions, and so forth.
So you can use your ORCID password to log into other platforms. Can those platforms find you without your permission, either because you've logged into them with ORCID, or if they want to verify something, if they have an agreement with ORCID, can they do that?
When you encounter a system that connects with ORCID, you'll see a pop-up that will explain anything that system wants to do with your ORCID record. So in the case of publishers, a lot of times it's just they want to know your ORCID ID, and they want to perhaps read parts of your ORCID record. So you have the option of agreeing to that or denying that. So other systems may want to add information to your ORCID record. Those are typically universities and possibly, in very rare cases, a funder that will just acknowledge that they gave you such and such grant. But the user is always explained, do they just want you to sign in with your ORCID? or do they want to read your ORCID record, or do they want to actually edit your ORCID record with their things? So I have a good example of a case where you would just sign in. There are some universities, research institutes, that use ORCID as a sign-on. Instead of their own unique user ID and password, they just use ORCID because they know most of their researchers already have one. So those HR things obviously don't add anything to the researcher's ORCID record. They just know that they know the password and it's easy to connect.
Okay, oh, that's good to know. Okay, so if someone does open an account with ORCID and they get an ORCID ID, what are the functions that ORCID has? What features can they start updating?
Anyone can open an ORCID record for free. And then, of course, like I said at the beginning, the benefit is a unique 16-digit identifier. So what can you do from there? Generally, the biggest benefit is to start figuring out which systems to connect to, because, okay, once you have your unique ID, that's great. But if you don't connect it to other places, then you're just kind of in the same boat of redoing the same administrative things that take up time from doing your research. So, for example, some parts of Asia are quite connected, some aren't. But if you get a ORCID record, we have what is called a search and link wizard. So that will have a list of systems that will automatically update your record with works that are probably associated with you, but maybe you don't work at a university or haven't had a publisher that's connected with ORCID. But a lot of systems like European PubMed and Scopus will have a record of that. So I've definitely had use cases where somebody opens an ORCID record, their universities or direct publishers haven't connected, but via something like, especially European PubMed, because that's a rather large trove of publications. They've seen 15 publications added to that once they connect to European PubMed and add those works, with their permission, of course.
Oh, you mean the user adds those items and it goes to PubMed, or the other way around?
The other way around. So there's a part in ORCID down near the work section. So like I say, let's have a scenario where I work at a university, no connection to ORCID. I've published with publishers, but not used my ORCID. But by going through a list of rather large entities that can actually connect via DOI, they will usually be able to find, are you the author of this publication? And then you can say yes and add them.
So it could be European PubMed, it could be Scopus, Web of Science. They're all guessing that it's linked to you, and then you have to verify which ones are your publications.
Yeah, you will usually get quite a small list, but yeah.
Oh, so they must know from other things, institution.
Yeah, my guess is that they know from Crossref, to be honest. So Crossref is really kind of another bit of the research infrastructure that really connects ORCID publications. Most publications will apply for a DOI from Crossref.
So somehow, if you haven't updated your record for a while, but you've been publishing papers, publishing things, if they have a DOI, somehow you can allow you to do an auto update.
Right. Yeah. Well, not an auto update. You have to initiate that bit. This is what I mean is this is the case where somebody's not connected to a system that is auto updating with ORCID. So this is where you would go to these entities, like they're typically have to do with DOIs. So they would check DOI metadata. So that is how the mechanism, they would look for that and then say, are these yours? Do you want to add to your ORCID record?
Yeah. So you can manually add them back.
Right.
So what else can you show in the record? So publications, how about preprints or jobs or prizes?
Yeah. A lot of what we've been focused on is, as we know, academic researchers do much, much more than just publications. So you're right, we do preprints through a few systems. So we talked about peer review, but that is one thing is certainly available. That's usually through third parties. There's also invited positions. There's a role that we call a service. So this would be if you are an editor at a journal, or say a reviewer of grants, I think that's really nice service because, a lot of times these sorts of activities are hidden from public view. And the fact that they're pushing that on behalf of the individual to the ORCID is really great. But beyond those, there's also patents, data sets, computer software. You can even, if the facility has it set up where you sign in via ORCID, kind of like the HR system that I mentioned before. So let's say you're using a specific laboratory or facility. If they have ORCID enabled, then eventually that will show up on your ORCID record as well once your end publication is out.
Okay, so what would you say to an early career researcher who doesn't know whether they should join, or is it already done through their institution, or do they have a choice?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a given, certainly not globally. Obviously, early career researchers are looking for recognition. So that could be conference papers, it could be dissertations, and it could be peer-reviewed publications. It benefits everyone, but specifically early career researchers is if you can manage to find sources that connect to ORCID. So that could be your university, it could be a publisher, or it could even be that same mechanism that I was mentioning where you can look through European PubMed. When works are added, not just works, but employment or education are added to an ORCID record, you can tell that it's from the outside source. So if you have anything that you're producing, even through Crossref, that gives it more credibility, especially compared to, say, a profile system. Because in ORCID, you can always see where the employment, the education, the work came from. So if you have, let's say, a conference paper from IEEE, it will show that as the source. That's much more credible than your own name. And that kind of adds to your credibility as an up-and-coming contributor to academic research.
I see. So you can see where an update came from. So it would say that Scopus did it or Web of Science did it.
Yes, and this is where the ORCID, I would say, we want everything to be visible, but then we also want all of the aspects to do with the ORCID registry to be trustworthy. So, for example, you could have someone who has a magnificent record of employment, education, publications, but if you look at each of them and you see that it's the same name as the record, well, you still have to find out if that's actually true or not. Whereas if you have someone, say an early career researcher, who only has, say, one job as a postdoc, maybe 2 conference papers and 1 article, if you can see that those are all submitted externally by University X and Publisher X, that's much more trustworthy.
And what else can ORCID allow people to do? Is it, even though it's not really like a social networking site, can other people use ORCID to look for potential collaborators?
Yeah, I suppose, it's not quite as sexy as, say, ResearchGate, and you can look through the ORCID registry. If people put keywords on their ORCID record, you can find it that way. The most reliable way is, of course, to use the API to retrieve information, or, a lot of folks just want to find out how many ORCID records they have at their institution. So, we'll leave the networking and the algorithms to other folks, but we're happy to connect with them. And if somehow that helps, then so be it. But that'll be somebody else's task, I suppose.
Do you have some other examples of who you're connected with? I noted some is Altmetric and Figshare can use the ORCID ID to log on to them.
Yeah, so Figshare for sure. Like we at ORCID, we log into Figshare with our ORCID ID, and usually our, let's say, presentations from ORCID are automatically placed back to our ORCID record from Figshare. So digital science one. Yeah, there's a number of platforms that are integrated in ORCID. A lot of small journals connect with Crossref. So you may submit something to a small journal and then they want a DOI. So they connect with Crossref. And then before you know it, your journal is in Crossref. Sometimes that happens seamlessly if you have an ORCID ID at the time where you log in with your ORCID, sometimes not. But And that what I would say is the main way to update your ORCID record is clicking on the Crossref metadata search, because they have a massive database of journal publications. And chances are, if you published in a journal, it's in there. And again, using that DOI technology, they should be able to match you up.
Now, we mentioned an institution could apply. So do they pay? Is their institution version paid? If you individually signed up, it's free for the user?
Yeah. So anyone can sign up for an ORCID ID and create an ORCID record for free. But as I'm probably mentioning, the benefit is when you connect it to other places. So how does ORCID maintain itself? I know we're a nonprofit, but we still have quite a lot of resources to maintain. So how we do that is institutions pay annual membership. So that's the difference. You could theoretically have a ORCID ID for free. You don't have any university or anything to deal with, but perhaps when you submit a manuscript, then you log in, then you're like, oh, okay, yes, I have one of those. And you do that. Hopefully that journal would pass that back to your ORCID record. But a lot of the time, the big benefit is through research institutions and other sorts of entities. I'm thinking of some government agencies in the United States, where through their annual membership fees, what they do is they add content to your ORCID record. And they do that through an API. And so that's how we sustain ourselves, is through those institutional membership fees, which has been growing quite a lot. Yeah.
It's not possible, though, to have two ORCIDs. So what if someone had a private free ORCID and then they join a university that is one of your members?
Right. So you're saying if somebody had, let's say, an individual ORCID through a Gmail, and then they join Hong Kong University and then didn't realize and they set up a duplicate ORCID. Is that what you mean?
Well, how would you control it so you only have one? Does the university know you've already got one?
They don't. So I'll tell you how ORCID distinguishes is always by emails. So this is why we always say to people, add many emails to your ORCID record, because if we can find your email in the ORCID registry, no problem. But it does happen that, say, somebody registers for an ORCID and then they register for another one with another email. As soon as we know about it, we have a process where we will ask, which one do you want to keep? What is your favorite one? And then essentially we will edit the other one so that if you go to the other one, it will point to the preferred one. So the whole point of ORCID is to be persistent and not delete anything, especially a 16-digit ID. We don't want anyone, let's say if you deleted that ID, then somebody else gets it 3 years later. That could be a huge headache. So we generally point the unwanted one at the wanted one when that arises.
Okay. Oh, that's a good point. You mentioned multiple emails, because if people change university a lot, so at least they'll be able to save the situation. There'll be a backup Yahoo or Gmail that they can use as a backup.
Yeah, I think I have about 4 emails on my record, just because I know you never know. You may leave an institution, but yeah, if you have several backups, then you'll be okay.
Now, what is the uptake of ORCID around the world, and especially in Asia?
So we have record holders in almost all 195 countries in the world, except for a few territories in the Atlantic. So that's pretty amazing. We have most of our record holders in India and China, as I suppose you might imagine. In that large context, I would say most of their content is added from publishers, because we don't have a large institutional member presence in the People's Republic of China and India. But those records do tend to have content from, say, a large publisher like Springer or something like that. But on average, I think there are generally about 40,000 records created per week. So to give you a bit of context, when I joined ORCID 3 years ago, we had 5 million ORCID IDs. Now, 3 years later, 12 million. It grows quite a lot.
And how many of those are in Asia?
Yeah, good question. I would have to say at least over 30%.
And so what are your plans or your strategies for Asia, and what exactly is your role in ORCID?
Well, We've grown a bit on the institutional side in Asia. So my role with ORCID is in Asia and working with institutions and members, and more specifically with consortia. So consortia are when a country has 5 or more organizations that choose to join forces. They choose a consortium lead organization, and they work with us in a community of practice approach. So one thing that's been really great, we have a consortium in Japan as of last year, and they've grown to 20 members last month. So for individual institutions, we've recently gained member institutions in Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. So that's all in the last 2 years. So I would say in summary, where we want to promote the endeavors by mature ORCID institutions in Asia. So those are usually the consortia, while looking for and expanding growth into underrepresented areas like South Asia. So South Asia, as I just mentioned, they're a big part of the individual ORCID record holder group, but there's only 2 member institutions. So just think of all those researchers there that are not quite getting the benefit of connecting to different systems, right? So that's one thing we'd like to concentrate on. My role specifically at ORCID is I'm the point person for the Japan, Taiwan, Australia, and New Zealand consortia, as well as the Canadian consortium for the moment. And what I do is I work with them in a variety of technical communications, like events and strategic projects.
Okay. So we'll finish it up in a minute. So it's a good idea for researchers, especially early career researchers, to have an ORCID ID, to have a persistent number for their career, to identify themselves, and also to protect themselves so other people don't claim their publications. You've got some proof that it was yours.
True.
So finally, how and why did you get involved in ORCID?
Well, I was previously a scholarly communications librarian at Hong Kong Baptist University. Did that until 2017. And I joined ORCID in 2018. I'm still based in Hong Kong. So I like the idea of working for a small organization. ORCID's only about 35 staff, and we live in 15 countries. But I also like the idea of working at an organization that was at the forefront of development and changes in the academic research community. And the fact that it's a nonprofit international organization with a lot of contacts in the global academic sphere intrigued me a lot. It's really great to have colleagues where you run into someone and they want to know about what's going on with research in such and such in Botswana or Sri Lanka or Northeast Canada, and you can find someone that probably knows what's going on there. Also, in the 3 years I've been there, it was quite a startup atmosphere, but it's turning into more of an established organization.
That's interesting. Now, for people who want more information or who want to open an account, what's the website URL for ORCID?
Sure. https orchid.org. ORCID spelled ORCID.org.
Okay, great. So Brian, thank you very much for joining us on this podcast and for explaining why it's a good idea for researchers to have an ORCID ID. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Thank you.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Asiaedit Et Al podcast. For more publishing advice, visit Asiaedit.com. I'm Trevor Lane, and I hope you tune in next time for more expert publishing tips.